Bjorn and I recently chatted about insights we gathered from a survey targeted at college students and some of the top concerns they expressed as it relates to fall 2020. These survey results launch us into a conversation about how the website is now essentially the new equivalent of campus life, and we talk through tactics that colleges may want to employ to help their current and incoming students better navigate the uncertainty and the unknown that fall term holds. We also touch on how different learning styles may benefit from asynchronous or hybrid learning environments and how some age-old maxims still apply to these contexts. Lastly, we conclude by focusing on how your students' goals can help you craft the right content and the right experience to help answer and help guide them through the unknown, and how timeless information design principles are still just as relevant and important as they ever have been.
So Bjorn, you work with a lot of higher ed institutions and you've heard from a lot of them, wondering how things have been shaping up. What are things that you've been hearing in the past couple of months?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, things are changing very quickly for people. There's a lot of new realities for people, new realities of how they work and how they communicate. People have a lot of questions for us when we talk to them about, what's the most effective way to communicate with prospective students and other groups? What are some things that we should be adding to our site to make it more relevant for people who might have anxieties around whether it's online learning or whatever that might be? Then also, how do we sort of balance the need for content that's helping people understand the institution's kind of opening plans and its kind of response, its safety protocols, all those different things, with the classic things that students always care about, whether it's cost or quality of education and all those things. So I mean, that shouldn't really see. It's still obviously in flux. It's changing for people obviously day to day, but typically people are trying to understand how they can kind of effectively adapt without abandoning the things that they know are strengths of their institution that they want to make sure they can keep highlighting.
Yeah, and what were some things that you suspected maybe students were wondering about,
Right.
and some thoughts around how you think higher ed institutions might be able to anticipate some of those needs and questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of the things that we were talking about internally as we were kind of preparing for this presentation was, what's on students' minds? What are they thinking about, and what kind of fears or hopes do they have as they're kind of thinking about this new environment? Some of the things that we were imagining, probably they were just trying to understand from each institution, like what that institution's actual sort of what its plans look like, what being a student might look like, how courses might be delivered, just understanding like the terrain and what life might actually be like as they're kind of entering in the fall, because we couldn't, we were sort of we're kind of guessing what students were, what was on students' minds. We actually thought it might be useful to run a survey and just ask students directly what's top of mind for them as they're thinking about fall 2020 and kind of enrolling in a school or applying for school.
So we put that survey out, and maybe you can give us a bit of an idea of the kinds of questions that we asked or topics that we were curious about.
Sure. So, I mean, we asked some questions just to understand what kinds of people were responding. We asked what kind of institution people were attending, whether it's a 4-year or 2-year, private, public, and so on. And just understanding the mix of people who are applying, whether they're continuing learners, first-time freshmen, or whatever it might be. But I guess kind of the heart of the survey was really asking people what your top 3 biggest concerns for the fall term were, just to understand, what are the things that, what are the new things and the traditional things that are kind of occupying people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, when we looked at the results, some of them were not totally surprising, like
Right.
costs and paying for
Hmm.
school, right? Especially given the economic climate at the moment. But there were a few themes that emerged that were, I don't know if I'd say surprising, but I wouldn't have expected them to be in the top three. How about you? What did you think about the things that kind of floated to the top?
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed. I mean, you would think, especially given the economic environment where, there's a lot of economic uncertainty out there, that for sure people would be worried about costs. They'd be worried about the ROI of attending all those different things, and that did show up in the data. But that didn't show up in the top two responses. The number one most common concern for people was just staying focused in an online learning environment. And similarly, another popular one was just staying motivated, and also concerned that their studies that to date don't translate well to an online format. Just a feeling of kind of mystery or anxiety around the online experience, and not sure if they'll be successful or if it'll be a good and positive experience for them.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that three themes that were very much related to each other were in sort of like that top five,
Mm.
all sort of in that general vicinity. So we had staying focused in an online learning environment, but also staying motivated and then just being disconnected.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and it's interesting, like when we look at a lot of institutional like information that's out there, a lot of it is very fact-based,
Mhm.
meaning like here's what's happening, here's what's not happening, here's what's open, here's what's not open.
Totally.
And have you come across anything where it's really addressed kind of the psychological and sort of that motivational side of things?
I don't think very much. I mean, I haven't looked at every higher education site in North America over the last couple of months, but generally, I mean, we look at a lot of sites, and we don't see that very often. I think it would be, um, it would be extremely beneficial and productive for institutions to think about how they can address this anxiety, because it's obviously pretty widespread, and it is something that if expanding the content strategy from talking about um, the value proposition of the institution, or how to apply, and the kind of the nuts and bolts of becoming a student, and thinking about that dimension of that psychological dimension of what of addressing some of those concerns people have about this, almost like a black box that people are feeling right now of like, what's it going to be like in the fall? Can I hack it? And is it going to be a good and positive experience?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about that because it's almost like the equivalent of campus life, which is where
Yeah.
students, prospective students and new students go to kind of
Mhm.
ease that anxiety. But now the campus could potentially be your room. So,
Exactly.
and that life is kind of taking place in your mind. So how do you prepare for that, and how do you get ready and anticipate what that might be like?
Yeah, I mean, and as much as that is maybe a sometimes is something that not a whole lot of higher education institutions are addressing directly, it's also a huge opportunity for these institutions, because if this is, I mean, part of the good news of this survey, and I'm sure we could continue to survey students, collect more data, and get even more nuanced details on what their frame of mind is. But if this is one of the huge patterns that comes up, I think this is something, a real opportunity to engage students more directly and differentiate, because you know any any ability for the institution to speak to how to stay focused in an online learning environment, how your studies can translate to online learning, is obviously going to kind of speak right to the heart of what people care about. So I think there's almost like a wide open field right now, because there aren't a lot of people doing this. There's a real opportunity to kind of stand out and really connect with people in a very kind of direct and deep way.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of the comments we received back, it describes sort of this perception of a lesser experience. So the assumption is, and rightly so, is that online is not going to be as rich and as wonderful
Mhm.
as face to face. And it does seem like there is that opportunity to demonstrate some of that value in
Definitely.
remote or hybrid learning. Any thoughts on ways that higher ed institutions might be able to show some of that cost and
Mhm.
value proposition?
Yeah, I mean, for some groups, it's going to be more straightforward to do that. So that's a really, really good question. there's lots of state schools, there's lots of community colleges, and many other groups too, who do a lot of online and hybrid learning anyway, and have a really good track record and have a story to tell that is that predates COVID-19. So for those groups, what I'm seeing is some of them are kind of speaking to that directly, some of them aren't. So I would say if you have a track record to talk about, maybe lean into that a little bit more. I think it's to your benefit and it's to the benefit of people who are applying. I think for groups that aren't for whom that's not like typically a big part of their delivery model, and it's new for them as well, or it's a transition for them. I think at least acknowledging it, I think is really helpful. That these are challenges. As much as we can sort of empathize with the experience of the students, I think it's extremely beneficial. Knowing that it's a new experience for everyone. If I know some groups will be sort of feel some anxiety maybe about acknowledging a challenge that they don't have an instant solution for. So I think one way that to follow up on that empathy with is to offer some advice, tips, and some guidance on how to be successful in this environment. Whether that's talking about support services that already exist in the university, pointing people to resources that we know are actually useful, whatever that might be, or even just to talk about some of the statistics of how some of the outcomes of people who have been very successful in online learning, and some information about how how online learning can be as effective as a delivery model. It can be an effective delivery model for students as well.
Yeah, for sure. And thinking back to like some of the anxiety around motivation and that online component, and people kind of coming to terms with that, I think there's an opportunity to demonstrate how asynchronous learning can help kind of offset or maybe alleviate some of those anxieties, because it's way more flexible. Yep. And so you don't have maybe that same pressure that you would have face-to-face, and perhaps could even allow certain students to feel like it's more advantageous for their learning, whereas face-to-face might have a different experience, but could be not quite as flexible for their where they're at or how they like to learn too.
Yeah, that's a great point about learning styles. I mean, the research, like I know there's lots of research, not just in education, but just in general, in psychology and other fields, that shows the ability for particularly people who kind of are classified as introverts to have a little bit of time to respond to something and not have to respond to something in the moment. Often has a huge benefit, can help people respond more meaningfully, have a more quality, confident response, and feel like they have the adequate time to really think through a subject before they answer. So there might be, not that we're trying to spin this COVID-19 situation as advantages only, but I think there's something to that. Like a lot of people thrive in an asynchronous environment because it gives people a chance to really grapple with the material, think it through, sometimes even see other responses from other students, and really kind of come up with a really well thought through response that is a good fit with their learning preference.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think perhaps like the field for discussion is more level then. And so instead of just hearing certain voices, you have the potential of hearing lots of voices. And that transparency could offer up a very rich learning experience. And then perhaps likewise, the transparency in showing those different types of ways of delivering course material could also maybe act as a way to offset some of that anxiety. So it's not just a future of Zoom calls where it's one way, being pushed, which could potentially be their nightmare or what they're dreading. But that, there's opportunities for discussion, there's opportunities to bring a lot more things into the classroom and have more of a chance for conversation with their peers and with their instructors too.
Yeah, I think there's a bit here of like similar kind of advice that you might give somebody when they're thinking about how can I highlight my campus or the educational kind of the facilities and the amenities and so on of the educational experience, I think there's similar advice of like show not tell. If it's possible to kind of give people a little bit of a demo or a little bit of understanding of what life is like as a learner in this environment, I think it's really valuable. I think for a lot of people, we can say we can tell them we're using Canvas or Blackboard, or they don't know what that means. And until we can actually maybe show them a little bit of a walkthrough of what it might be like to study there, and help them understand, what life might be like as a student, and how you're kind of how the institution engages you, how you're supported, all those different elements.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on that. Like showing would be very wonderful
Yeah,
to kind of demonstrate these things that might be abstract in principle.
totally.
And probably there's opportunity. I mean, you see with museums and other types of institutions, they're getting
Hmm.
very creative in terms of how they're guiding people through what is normally a tour.
Hmm.
And so even like campus tours and things like that, there could be an opportunity of showing some of that, even though students might not be able to go and visit quite yet, giving them something to kind of pin and look forward to and know what to expect once they're able to resume having those in-person classes and live on campus and all those wonderful things too.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people are worried about doing things perfectly, and sometimes sacrifice the good for the perfect. And I think even the ability to thoughtfully consider this question of how can we show people what it's like to be a learner now is going to be appreciated. Maybe we can't show people slick demos of what it's like to be a learner right now, or like try Blackboard for or a demo account or something. Just anything we can do to help them kind of understand that, first of all, this is actually, we care about keeping you focused. We care about ensuring you make a smooth transition to online learning. And then, absolutely anything that can be done to kind of just help them visualize the experience. I mean, there's a reason why campus tours historically have been one of the most coveted actions from a prospective student, because a very large percentage of people who attend a campus tour become a student and convert to a student. And part of it is just like, now they can see, now they can visualize, they understand better, they feel a sense of like affinity and connection. So as much as we can kind of just help them imagine this future state, the more it's going to be a successful user journey for them.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing is they can imagine themselves there. It's almost as if they are already there and can imagine what a day in the life of is like on the campus tour. And so likewise, it could be helpful to maybe just give a tiny snapshot of what
Yeah.
life might be like on the positive
Mhm.
sides of things for the hybrid model or
Yep.
remote learning or whatever flexible options that schools might be exploring at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see, like, I think that was a great point that you had about um, online learning actually being a strength for a lot of students, especially since over 50% of people self-identify as like a introvert, and certainly as at least an ambivert. I think a lot of people appreciate the ability to dive into a subject I think that in general, I think a lot of people, um, you know, a lot of people thrive in the online learning environment more than they think they would.
So it seems like a lot of institutions are doing their very best to try and be communicative and transparent with where they're at in the process and what they're expecting, and kind of helping people come to terms with what does this mean for me right now.
Hmm.
Uh, most sites don't seem to have been designed for this situation
Yes.
in mind. We designed for a world where you
Sure.
might have an
It's all
emergency
new.
alert, and
Yeah.
it would be a few sentences and then it'd point you to like one information notice. But most designs did not design for something where you might have to build essentially a microsite to
Hmm.
address an evolving situation.
For sure.
Curious about your thoughts on what you're seeing in terms of the content that's being published right now around COVID and how schools are handling the situation and kind of doing that expectation setting.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it definitely seems like, um, obviously there's naturally going to be a period of time when people need to be reactive. It's a new situation. They need to come up with a lot of accurate and targeted content in a really fast time frame. And I think in the first, few weeks after like early March, I think, I think everyone is in the same boat. Students were trying to understand this new environment. School administrators, admissions officers were trying to understand this new environment. So just getting the information online was the best they could really do at that point. But I think at this point, everybody knows that coronavirus exists. It's out there. Having a page that's laden with alerts, like a homepage that's laden with alerts, for example, or a coronavirus update section that isn't sort of crafted to help people find information quickly or identify information that's relevant to them, starts to become a liability. It starts to become in the same way that a higher education site that was designed for 6 years ago that was primarily about news and events and didn't help people understand, how to apply or how to give or help people sort of reach their journey successfully or even understand about the institution. I think in the same way, getting the information online is necessary but not sufficient. And I think that's something that institutions haven't necessarily grappled with as much as how they can get the right information up in a way that's timely and accurate, but then help somebody, especially think about like a 17-year-old who isn't necessarily familiar with navigating this sort of this higher education landscape, or somebody who doesn't know a whole lot about you. Just ensuring that the content you're presenting is readable, that it's scannable, that the content is oriented around users' goals and not just what the institution is trying to communicate, like a series of like endless like updates and alerts. I see that a lot where people have like 400 updates and then each day there's a new update, but there's really no way to make sense as a whole of what the institution's stance is, what its plans are, what this means to me, how I can learn effectively in this environment, all those things. I think it's just, it feels like it's almost in its infancy, this ability to kind of effectively communicate when probably it almost feels like sometimes people have just need to remind themselves of some of the things they already know about good user experience.
Yeah, so it sounds like the information is there and perhaps too much information.
Yes,
and
there's no shortage of
so
that.
Information design would be the next step of like kind of going back and building some hierarchy into it, creating good navigation systems, because
Right.
there's a lot of different audiences
Yes.
to absorb this content. And so potentially you might want to help people find the right information for their particular situation or their particular context. And then just some general principles of like grouping things together and creating meaningful headlines and archiving the things that are no longer relevant. And it's funny because in the couple of user studies that we've done in the past few months, we have a very jaded audience now,
Yes,
where the second they see that ubiquitous image of the virus or that alert, there's kind of that eye roll and, oh boy,
absolutely.
Here we
Very
go.
much.
Tell me something I don't already know. And in a way, it's like what you said, it's not even that the message is meaningless. It has now actually become a detrimental message. You're not presenting anyone with anything new, and it's getting in the way of the information that they're actually looking for.
I think so. And I think institutions, they have a lot of different mandates they need to balance. Obviously, they need to think about safety. They need to think about accuracy. And a lot of times these updates need to be vetted there's a more complex process to put up information that might be about safety or medical information. So I understand why getting the information out there is important, and it's been prioritized. It's just getting it out there quickly and accurately. But it might be time to, if the institution hasn't already, maybe get the UX designer or the information architect or your content strategist more in the mix of how to, like you say, Laura, how to take this content that is valuable and useful, and make sure that it is like you say, clear, that it's easy to find and filter down to the information that's relevant just to you, and also that it's, if you're presenting updates as well as kind of user goal oriented content, like content for parents or content for prospective students and staff, finding ways to balance that, so that not every page starts with a coronavirus update at the top. I'm not sure how valuable that is really at this point, because I suspect, especially as people navigate deeper into the site, that's probably not what they're looking for. They're looking to be able to find that information when they need to, but to have it have the appropriate weight, so it doesn't overwhelm the content that they're really looking for.
Yeah, and going back to one of the earlier things that you talked about is showing, not telling. And something I've noticed with a lot of the information that's out there, it's largely text-based and very long blocks of
Yeah.
text. Any thoughts or suggestions on how higher ed can do a better job of formatting or presenting that kind of content, or expanding maybe their definition of content?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of times people think about design as being primarily about color or imagery and things like that. And it might be quite challenging for folks to think about how to take their coronavirus update page and make it more appealing or more um, kind of digestible through imagery, because coming up with the same graphic of the round coronavirus is probably not really gonna do it. So maybe more effective way of making the information scannable, clear, chunked, and digestible. Yeah, I think clear headlines, even like basic techniques like accordions, search filters, the ability to kind of maybe you have a clear visual hierarchy that makes it, that sort of puts a background behind sort of more important information, so that people kind of know what to look at and how to look at it. I think that there's a lot of points that have been known in user experience for a long time, and applying some of those principles in the same way that you would 100% apply them to your academics page or program page. I think it's what the solution is known. It's just a matter of applying that same lens to this information, because without that, it in a way, because this information is so important and it's so relevant and potentially relevant to people's safety, that almost places more of an onus to make this information digestible, because if this information is important for people's safety, and if it might help lower their anxiety, so it's extremely sort of vital information. You want it to be easy to read. You want it to be easy to find. You don't want people to miss a piece of it. You want people to be able to get it right away. And the longer it is, the harder it is to read, the more likely it is people are to miss important stuff.
Yeah, for sure. You see some of the better sites that are addressing this by strategically using video, for example. And sometimes these are very informal videos from people fairly high up in administration, and it seems to be very well received by students. They appreciate that transparency and honesty, sort of forthrightness about the situation. In other cases, some of the sites, they're looking ahead, like they're giving people, again, kind of talking about a theme that I brought up earlier, something to look forward to. So like performances that are scheduled for next year, or research is resuming, or there's a virtual theater performance coming up. Just little things that isn't just, you must wear a mask on campus, please wash your hands, like we'll be using this tool. Just those experiential qualities that maybe speak to a little bit of students' concerns around missing out on all of the activities that a campus is known for. And so kind of recreating that feeling of community kind of that it's more than just the classes you're taking. If that
Mm,
makes sense.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess it's interesting you say that, because a lot of the examples you cited of, the kind of meat and potatoes information about, COVID-19 response, like, wearing a mask or cleaning protocols. I think, let's be honest, a lot of people know that stuff by now. It's not, and I think most people assume that a higher education institution is going to be doing those things. So I think that certainly didn't come up as a top concern for people, or top anxiety for people. I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the information that people are providing about the the kind of institutional response to make the environment safe or hospitable. So it's all useful and good, but a lot of it's redundant. People already know that stuff, and they kind of expect it. That's kind of like table stakes. And agreed that um, you know people, they want to feel that sense of sort of life and community, and that feeling that they're choosing to attend a specific institution, um, maybe because partly for their career goals, but also partly because it's an experience that they're looking forward to, that it's a sort of they're joining a new community, and they want to sort of engage with that community in more than just a transactional way. And yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, and you were talking a little bit about like the meat and potatoes stuff.
Right.
And I think something to bear in mind is the usual sort of meat and potatoes stuff that
Yeah.
students are looking for is still as important as it
Mhm.
was before. So these are
Definitely.
things like, tuition and the quality of instruction and sort of that value. What are some things that you think schools should not lose sight of
Mhm.
in the midst of trying to quickly course correct and adjust to these evolving circumstances?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I think you mentioned earlier we did some usability testing, asking prospective students to look at a few different sites right now in the world in higher education, and kind of evaluate their effectiveness or how appealing they were. And they all had sort of coronavirus updates at that time, all on the top of them, and everyone had the same reaction. Universally, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I kind of knew that. Now, what I want to know is, how much does it cost? When can I get in? What are the unique attributes of this program or this institution that are worth me paying attention to? Tell me about your curriculum, your educational quality. So I think all those things are really, really important. In some ways, not to say they're more important, but I think students are looking very carefully at specific aspects of an institution that matter maybe more now than ever. Like affordability is the huge one. I think that people are thinking about any ability to show outcomes. I think is a always relevant. It almost always comes up as the top 3 or 4 goal, but even more so now, where people are really thinking about okay, it's an uncertain environment, economic environment. If I'm going to be attending higher education, what's the payoff for me, and what kind of outcomes can I expect? So I think those things are almost like viscerally important to people at this point, because they're making a big investment. There's a lot of uncertainty in it, and more than ever, they want to understand how they can plan for it, how they can afford it, and what kind of future they might expect from this investment.